Tami Montgomery on AM 1460 KDMA, and it's 4 o'clock Talk with Tami, where we have in the studios with us Mr. Timothy Cameron, a public speaker for MADD. And you're going to talk to us today. Our topic for today is about restorative justice. Tell us a little bit about restorative justice and exactly what that is.
Restorative justice is a philosophy where we bring in a comprehensive approach to dealing with victims and offenders in the state of Minnesota, where it originated. And restorative justice is where we try to seek balance between offender and the victim, where both sides are being met as an entire whole human being. And healing for the victim, where they get humanized in the criminal justice process rather than made to be silent, and likewise with the offender, they speak up. So both sides are talking to each other and dialoguing, and from the heart, coming from a emotional, spiritual, very human level, where everyone is humanized in the setting in a courtroom, or sometimes in a healing circle if a judge so decides that he or she will allow a healing circle to take place.
How does something like this get started? Is it just one party asks for it, or how is it decided that both parties are going to decide on restorative justice?
Oftentimes, the victim themselves will come forward and say, I would like to dialogue with the person that hurt me or my family. And there was a case in New York where a woman asked to speak to the person who raped her. And it was a very, traumatic thing in her life, obviously. But she thought, I need to heal from this. I need to face every fear I have. Right. And she felt she needed to do that for her, but she also felt that she needed to, as a person, a faith-based person who believes in forgiveness, that she needed to do something with that. And so she requested to sit down with him. And the setting was different for them because it was in a prison. But typically, though, it's in a community setting where you'll have a victim-offender mediator present who's been trained to deal with dialoguing between the two sides. But usually it's the victim who comes forward. It's rarely the offender who does that. And sometimes a judge will be totally on board with, say, I like restorative justice, I like what it does, I've seen it work, people's lives are changed, the offender quits recidivizing, and let's do this, I will suggest it.
It's interesting that you said that it's rarely the offender that actually comes forward and asks for restorative justice, because they're often the ones that need the forgiveness and asking for it in a situation where, like you said, sometimes can be absolutely heinous or, is hard to do.
I have an example about that. If I could share a story about Mary Jo Robinson. She is the woman who got me involved with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADD, Minnesota. And I heard her speak about losing her son, Mark, to a drunk driver. Mark was driving home from the airport going through St. Paul on Highway 94 near the Mounds area, and a drunk driver was also driving on 94 around that bend, but he was going the wrong way in the freeway. So Mark and the offender collided head on, and Mark was killed instantly. And Mary Jo, at the time of sentencing, approached the young man who killed her son and wanted to connect with him, and from the heart, from a place of forgiveness, but he didn't know that. Nobody, in fact, she was breaking some rules to even walk up to the guy, and she wanted to make her victim impact statement, which in Minnesota, every victim has an opportunity to do that by law prior to sentencing. And this guy did not want to make eye contact with Mary Jo. Who would? I mean, he is responsible for taking her son's life.
Right.
And he was almost crippled with the guilt and the shame of it. And she reached out and she put her hand underneath his chin and asked his permission. She said, please look me in the eyes when I tell you this. I want you to receive this if you would. And gently lifted his face up, and their eyes met. And she said, I want you to know something. I want you to know that I love you and I forgive you. And he started crying instantly, and she reached her arms around him and held him as he cried uncontrollably in that courtroom. And she just repeated the words, "I love you and I forgive you." She said, I'm in this 12-step program. I'm a Christian. Both teach forgiveness. And now that life is really, really tough, did I mean any of that? Or was it just a bunch of talk, a bunch of hooey?
Right, exactly.
That just made me feel good in the moment. Mm-hmm. She said, I have to step up and do this. And besides, forgiveness is for me, too. It's not just for him.
Right. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. It's not a gift you give the other person. I understand that. Powerful message in that she was able to walk the walk and talk the talk. Yeah,
that's the phrase she used, come to think of it. I forgot about that. Yeah. The judge was so impacted by that himself, because you said, how does this get initiated? How does restorative justice come into, play?
Right, especially when you said it's not always encouraged by our justice system.
Mm-hmm. Right, it's adversarial. They're really afraid of letting people be,
confrontational.
Yeah, but in a way that is safe, but yet. Well, anyway, okay, right. Judge Campbell, he's no longer on the bench. He's retired now, but he watched this, and afterwards he said, in all of my years as a judge on the bench, I have never seen such an act of love in my courtroom, ever. And he was on the bench a long time. Wow. And that, in my opinion, should be more the norm. It shouldn't be the exception. Right. We should have humanization of the victim. Shouldn't have to be quiet because they're going to contaminate the case, and the victim is going to have it mistrialed and thrown out because, and likewise, if the offender says anything, then he's found guilty because it's always used against him. But in a healing circle, all of the dialogue gets used for everyone's enrichment and healing and moving forward. The offender has to make right what he did wrong, he or she did wrong. Right. You pay him back. If you stole $1,000, you pay him back $1,000, or come to an agreement with the offender, victim offender, how that will happen. Both sides have to agree. Nobody's running the show with a healing circle. Okay,
tell us a little bit about a healing circle. That's part of what you're talking about today, which is restorative justice, and a healing circle is part of that. Define healing circle to our listeners.
Typically, a healing circle, if anyone has any familiarity with the native system of sitting in a circle, it's kind of like some 12-step programs. They sit in a circle where you have equality. Everyone sits the same distance from each other. No one's the head honcho here. Somebody does officiate the group, if you will, but they're equals.
There's no leaders.
Right.
No governed leaders.
And they'll have sacred objects that they call talking sticks or talking objects, and they will take that object, and when it's their turn to share, they will have that sacred object in their hands. And it is so amazing the things that come out of people's mouths in those situations. The victim says exactly what happened, how the crime impacted their life. They can be as brutally honest as they need to be, but they're not there to tear somebody down.
But it all starts with a simple concept, a very elementary concept.
Yeah. And so there's a sacred essence that's brought into this healing session. And
almost an innocence.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah. I've seen people heal. The offenders often never get a chance to say they're sorry to the person they hurt, because if they do, they're admitting their guilt.
Right.
So the offender has to say, yes, I'm willing to sit down and go through this stuff. But I tell you what, there's some people, it's like they've never, ever exposed their heart to another human being.
Right.
And this is their first chance. And people break down and they get so honest, and it turns the offender's lives. They're just amazingly feeling clean when they leave. Right. And they say, I agreed to do something about it, and then they do it.
Right. There's a sense of freedom there that they've would have never known otherwise. Absolutely amazing. How can we encourage, I want to be in a place where, and I think you are on the same page, where you want to encourage more things like restorative justice in today's society. How do we go about doing that?
I think if first people should probably get educated about it. Go to a website on restorative justice. If you Google RJ that would probably get you right to a restorative justice site. But Google restorative justice. I've been speaking for different groups. One of those is the Restorative Justice Council of St. Croix Valley. You could look that up. And I speak at impact panels where people that have driven under the influence of alcohol listen to us speak, and we take an approach that is non-threatening, non-judgmental, but I talk about how I drove under the influence and I killed a 6-month-old child in 1977, and I go full circle with that story where I did time, I had consequences, now I'm speaking, I'm trying to remember little Timmy, the baby's name, and to honor his memory, and I feel like little Timmy and I made an agreement somewhere that, he would give his life and I would spend my life talking about it, and we would raise people up into an awareness, into a healing place. Right. And amazingly, after 20 years of speaking, the mother of little Timmy contacted me. Really? And now we are friends. We're friends on Facebook, which sounds like a strange thing to have happened, but and as she and I were
Stranger things have happened, though.
Yeah, it's like Mary Jo hugged her offender. Well, this has happened between Sherry and myself. Sherry's little Timmy's mom. And she said, and I was amazed to hear this, and I had a hard time wrapping my mind around it for some while. She said, "You're one of the best things that's ever happened to me in my life." Her daughter drove under the influence of alcohol, had a crash, and she thought, "Oh my God, this has happened in my life before." Right. She could have killed somebody. And then, the universe is a strange place. Right after she thought she should get a hold of me, her husband comes home with an article where we were speaking on restorative justice years ago, and they did a UPI article, went across the nation, and he ends up with that in his hands and puts it into her hands and says, "Look, here's an article on this guy." And she contacted MADD Minnesota, and we ended up dialoguing, and now we're friends, and we've gone to some really deep spiritual places together. And
that
it's amazing.
Sounds like complete divine intervention if I ever heard it.
Absolutely.
That's incredible. Incredible. Yeah. Well, if people want to read more about restorative justice and read more about you and your story and your speaking engagements, tell us where they can go to.
Sure. I have, if you want to do Facebook, everyone does Facebook nowadays. Right. I also do Twitter, but Facebook, Cameron.communications with a Z, not an S. Right. On Facebook. And you can find me. Timothy G. Cameron is my name. Okay. And you could just type in Timothy G. Cameron and find my poetry too. But if you do the Cameron Communications, that's where you'd go and you would find things about my story. I am writing a book titled The 10th Leper. That's the God I know. Yeah. And the 10th leper, other stories from the 10th leper. So you can find out about that too.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being in the studio with us today. And I hope that you come and visit us again.
That would be swell. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the time.
Okay.
Hey, God bless everybody.
All right. Thank you very much. Again, that was Timothy Cameron, public speaker for MADD, talking to us today about restorative justice. If you have any questions or if you want more information on him or his story or speaking engagements, or maybe you'd like to have him as a public speaker come and speak to you, go to facebook.com/Cameron.communications with a Z. This has been Tami Montgomery on AM 1460 KDMA.